On the morning of May 8, 1945, the prediction came true. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had been appointed Führer just days earlier, inheriting the wreckage of the Third Reich from Adolf Hitler's corpse. But as German officers stood in the Allied headquarters at Reims, France, watching General Alfred Jodl sign their nation's unconditional surrender, they witnessed something Dönitz had warned about since 1943. They witnessed British sea power. The statistics told the story that German pride had refused to accept. Over 800 U-boats had been built during the war. More than 700 had been destroyed. Of the 40,000 men who served in the U-boat force, approximately 30,000 were dead. The submarine weapon that was supposed to starve Britain into submission had instead become a death sentence for German sailors. And the waters of the Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard for German ambitions. What those German officers saw that morning was not just military defeat. It was the visible proof of everything their own commanders had warned them about during the war. And as the surrender documents were signed, the admirals who had led Germany's naval campaign were left to contemplate a truth they had been told but refused to believe. Britain's sea power was never the secret. The secret was that Germany's leaders had known about it during the conflict and still chose to continue. This is the story of what German admirals said about British sea power both before and after it was too late to matter. The warning began with a man who understood submarine warfare better than almost any officer in the German Navy. Karl Dönitz had spent his entire career preparing for the Battle of the Atlantic. During World War I, he had served as a U-boat commander in the Mediterranean. On October 4, 1918, his submarine, UB-68, was attacking a British convoy when mechanical failures forced him to surface. British warships captured his boat, and Dönitz spent the final months of the war as a prisoner in England. He was 27 years old when he was taken prisoner. He had tasted the bitter reality of submarine warfare, the claustrophobic steel tubes hunting massive convoys across hostile seas. He bore the knowledge of what happened when a submarine's luck ran out, and nothing in his previous experience suggested that Germany could ever win a sustained campaign against British sea power. But Dönitz was not a defeatist. He believed submarines could work, if used correctly. During his captivity in England, he had time to think about what had gone wrong in World War I. German U-boats had operated independently, hunting alone across vast expanses of ocean. Their successes were spectacular but isolated. Their failures were equally isolated. There was no coordination, no mass tactics, no way to concentrate force against defended convoys. Dönitz returned to Germany with ideas. He studied the British convoy system that had defeated German submarines in 1917 and 1918. He analysed why independent U-boat operations had failed. He developed tactical concepts that would transform submarine warfare. He called his innovation the Rudel tactic, the wolf pack. Instead of submarines hunting alone, they would hunt in groups. Scouts would find a convoy and radio its position. Other U-boats would converge on the target. They would attack simultaneously from multiple directions, overwhelming the convoy's escorts. It was elegant, it was deadly, and it required something Germany did not have in sufficient quantities: submarines. Throughout the 1930s, as Germany rearmed, Dönitz argued relentlessly for U-boat construction. He studied British shipping patterns and calculated how many submarines he would need. The numbers were specific and sobering. To starve Britain, Germany would need to sink approximately 750,000 tons of Allied shipping per month. To maintain that sinking rate, he would need at least 300 operational U-boats. 1/3 would be on station in the Atlantic. 1/3 would be in transit to or from patrol zones. 1/3 would be in port for repairs, resupply, and crew rest. This was not speculation. Dönitz had calculated the mathematics of maritime attrition. He presented his requirements to Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the Kriegsmarine. He explained the strategic necessity. He showed the calculations. He was told that Germany could not build 300 submarines. Resources were needed for surface warships, for the grand battleships and cruisers that represented traditional naval power. When war came in September 1939, Dönitz commanded 57 U-boats. Of those, only about 20 were suitable for Atlantic operations. The rest were small coastal submarines designed for operations in the North Sea and Baltic. Dönitz had asked for 300. He received 1/5 of what he needed. Despite the shortage, the U-boats began to kill. In September 1939, U-29 torpedoed the British aircraft carrier HMS Courageous, sending her to the bottom with over 500 men. In October, U-47 penetrated the defences of Scapa Flow, the supposedly impregnable British naval base, and sank the battleship HMS Royal Oak at anchor. Over 800 British sailors died. The boldness of these attacks shocked Britain. German newspapers celebrated. U-boat commanders became national heroes. Günther Prien, who had sunk Royal Oak, received a personal decoration from Hitler. The propaganda portrayed the U-boat force as invincible. But Dönitz counted his submarines. He knew that individual spectacular successes meant nothing. What mattered was sustained sinking tonnage. And with 57 submarines, he could not sustain the campaign he knew was necessary. The first phase of what Dönitz would later call the happy time began in June 1940, after the fall of France. With French Atlantic ports now under German control, U-boats could reach their hunting grounds much faster. They no longer had to make the dangerous journey around Scotland and through the North Sea. They could operate from Brest, Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, cutting thousands of miles from their transit time. More time on patrol meant more ships sunk. And the British were unprepared. Royal Navy escorts were scarce. Many had been lost during the evacuation from Dunkirk. Most of the remaining destroyers were old, dating from World War I. They lacked modern detection equipment. Their sonar, called ASDIC by the British, was primitive and unreliable. Convoys crossed the Atlantic with inadequate protection, sometimes just 2 or 3 escorts guarding 40 or 50 merchant ships. The wolf packs tore into them. From June to December 1940, German U-boats sank over 270 Allied merchant ships. The tonnage exceeded 1.5 million tons. Ships carrying food, fuel, raw materials, and weapons disappeared beneath the Atlantic waves. Each ship took its cargo and crew with it. Tankers exploded in fireballs that could be seen for miles. Freighters broke apart and sank in minutes. Lifeboats drifted in freezing waters, their occupants dying of exposure before rescue could arrive. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later wrote that the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. Britain was an island nation dependent on imports. Food came from North America. Fuel came across the Atlantic. Raw materials for Britain's factories arrived by ship. If the sea lanes were cut, Britain would starve and its industry would halt. And in late 1940, it appeared the Germans might succeed. But Dönitz was not celebrating. While his colleagues praised the sinking statistics, he watched his submarine numbers. U-boats were being lost to accidents, to British aircraft, to depth charges from escorts. New construction was replacing losses, but barely. He still had only about 60 operational submarines. He needed 300. He told anyone who would listen that without a massive increase in U-boat production, the campaign would fail. German naval leadership nodded and approved incremental increases. The shipyards received orders for more submarines. But Germany's industrial resources were divided among multiple competing priorities. The army needed tanks and artillery for the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe needed aircraft. The surface navy wanted battleships and cruisers. U-boats were just one priority among many. In 1941, the war expanded. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June, committing the vast majority of its military strength to the Eastern Front. In December, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and Hitler declared war on the United States. Dönitz immediately recognized what this meant. America possessed the largest merchant fleet in the world, and the industrial capacity to build ships faster than Germany could possibly sink them. He proposed Operation Drumbeat, sending U-boats to the American coast, where shipping was still undefended and vulnerable. In January 1942, German submarines arrived off the eastern seaboard of the United States and found conditions even better than they had hoped. American cities remained fully lit at night. Merchant ships sailed independently without escorts. There was no convoy system, no blackout, no coordination between Navy and Coast Guard units. U-boat commanders called it the second happy time. Ships were silhouetted against the lights of New York, Miami, and Norfolk. German submarines sat on the surface and picked off targets with methodical precision. For 6 months, U-boats ravaged American coastal shipping. From January to July 1942, they sank over 500 ships in American waters. Tankers exploded within sight of shore. Coastal residents watched ships burn on the horizon. Bodies and wreckage washed up on beaches. American newspapers demanded action. The Navy scrambled to organize defenses. But Dönitz knew it would not last. He watched the calendar and counted his submarines. He had learned from World War I that the Americans were not soft or unprepared by nature. They were simply unprepared at the moment of entry, but American industrial capacity, once mobilized, was vast beyond German comprehension. He had studied the statistics. American shipyards had built more merchant tonnage during World War I than all of Europe combined. American steel production dwarfed German output. American oil fields produced petroleum in quantities that made Germany's limited fuel supplies seem insignificant. Dönitz made his concerns explicit. In conferences with Hitler and the naval staff, he presented calculations showing that the U-boat campaign was mathematically hopeless unless production increased dramatically. He showed graphs of Allied shipbuilding capacity. He presented projections of how fast America could replace losses. He argued that Germany needed to be sinking 800,000 tons per month, every month, without pause. And he explained that with his current submarine force, he could not sustain that rate. His warnings were acknowledged but not acted upon. Hitler was focused on the Eastern Front. German industry was at maximum capacity. There were no surplus resources to massively expand U-boat construction. Dönitz was told to make do with what he had. By mid-1942, the Battle of the Atlantic was becoming a statistical contest between German sinking rates and Allied construction rates. And the Allies were beginning to win. American shipyards had perfected the Liberty ship, a standard cargo vessel that could be mass-produced using prefabrication techniques. The average construction time dropped from 244 days in 1941 to 42 days by 1943. American yards were launching multiple Liberty ships every day. British and Canadian shipyards were building similar vessels. For every 3 or 4 ships the U-boats sank, the Allies were building 4 or 5 replacements. The net tonnage of the Allied merchant fleet was growing, not shrinking. But the real change was happening in anti-submarine technology. The British had been developing new weapons and detection systems since 1939, refining them through bitter experience. By 1943, these technologies were reaching frontline units, and the effectiveness transformed overnight. The first game changer was radar. Early in the war, U-boats operated on the surface at night. They were small, fast, and difficult to see in darkness. Surface running allowed them to recharge batteries, travel at higher speeds, and position themselves ahead of convoys. But by 1942, British aircraft and ships carried increasingly sophisticated radar that could detect a submarine's conning tower from miles away. U-boats that surfaced at night found themselves illuminated by searchlights and under attack before they knew aircraft were near. Commanders who survived these night attacks reported the same experience. Cruising on the surface, suddenly a brilliant light, explosions, the crash dive alarm, men screaming as the submarine plunged desperately beneath the waves. The second technology was high-frequency direction finding, called huff-duff by Allied sailors. German U-boats communicated constantly by radio, reporting convoy positions, coordinating wolf pack attacks, receiving orders from headquarters. Each transmission could be detected, and its direction determined by shore stations and ships equipped with huff-duff. Multiple bearings would triangulate a U-boat's position. Convoy escorts learned that when their huff-duff operators detected transmissions, a submarine was nearby. They would vector patrol aircraft to the area or steam toward the transmission source, forcing the U-boat to dive or retreat. What Dönitz did not realize was that every time his wolf packs coordinated their attacks through radio communications, they were broadcasting their locations to the enemy. The very tactic that had made wolf packs deadly was now making them vulnerable. The third development was long-range patrol aircraft. Early in the war, there had been an air gap in the middle of the Atlantic where convoys sailed beyond the range of land-based aircraft. This gap was several hundred miles wide, and U-boats concentrated there, attacking convoys that had no air cover. But the Allies closed the gap through multiple methods. American B-24 Liberators were modified for very long-range patrol, extending their endurance with additional fuel tanks. British placed auxiliary fuel tanks in Sunderland flying boats and Catalina patrol aircraft. And most effectively, the British and Americans deployed escort carriers, small aircraft carriers that could accompany convoys and provide air cover throughout the entire Atlantic crossing. The fourth weapon was improved depth charges and ahead-throwing weapons. Traditional depth charges had to be dropped behind a submarine, which meant the escort lost sonar contact during the final moments of the attack. The submarine could maneuver unpredictably, and escorts often missed. But the British developed the Hedgehog, a mortar that fired 24 small bombs ahead of the attacking ship. The escort could maintain sonar contact throughout the attack, adjusting aim in real time. When a Hedgehog bomb struck a submarine, it detonated. When it missed, it sank harmlessly. This meant that if an escort heard an explosion, it knew the submarine was hit. The psychological effect on U-boat crews was devastating. They could hear the pattern of splashes as Hedgehog bombs entered the water around them, and then the explosions when contact was made. There was no escape, no evasion possible in the final seconds. The fifth and most critical advantage was intelligence. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had broken German naval codes. Throughout much of 1942 and early 1943, the Allies could read German U-boat communications, often within hours of transmission. They knew where wolf packs were forming. They knew which convoy routes were being targeted. They could route convoys around U-boat concentrations or reinforce escorts where attacks were expected. Dönitz never suspected that his communications were compromised. He believed the increase in Allied effectiveness was due to improved radar and tactics. He never imagined that the British were reading his orders to his submarine commanders. In March 1943, the U-boats seemed to be winning. They sank 108 Allied ships, totaling over 600,000 tons. It was one of the worst months of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. Dönitz believed he was close to the sustainable sinking rate that would strangle Britain. He had approximately 240 operational U-boats by this point, still short of his requirement, but more than he had ever commanded. But March 1943 was the high water mark. What happened next would change everything. In April 1943, the sinking rate dropped to 235,000 tons. In May, it collapsed to 163,000 tons. But what shocked Dönitz was not the tonnage decrease, it was the U-boat casualties. In May 1943, German submarines suffered catastrophic losses. 41 U-boats were destroyed in a single month. The odds had reversed. For every Allied merchant ship sunk, the Germans were losing a submarine. The average U-boat survival was dropping below 2 patrols. Young men boarded submarines in French ports, sailed into the Atlantic, and never returned. Experienced commanders who had survived dozens of patrols were dying. Entire wolf packs were being wiped out. Dönitz received loss reports from his operational headquarters and realized what was happening. The British had achieved technological superiority. The Allies were not just defending convoys more effectively. They were hunting U-boats proactively. Aircraft equipped with radar were patrolling the Bay of Biscay, attacking U-boats in transit to and from their bases. Surface hunter-killer groups built around escort carriers were searching for submarines in the open Atlantic. The technology that Dönitz had hoped would take years to deploy was already operational. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz made the most difficult decision of his career. He ordered his submarines to withdraw from the North Atlantic. It was not a temporary tactical retreat. It was an admission that the campaign had failed. In his war diary, Dönitz wrote that losses had reached unsustainable levels. He could not sacrifice his crews in battles they could no longer win. The withdrawal was kept secret from the German public. Propaganda continued to celebrate U-boat successes. But German naval officers understood what had happened. The weapon that was supposed to defeat Britain had been defeated. The British had not won through courage alone, though British and Allied sailors had demonstrated extraordinary bravery. They had won through technology, industrial capacity, and scientific coordination. And Dönitz began to understand that Germany had been fighting a battle it was mathematically incapable of winning. The next phase of the war revealed exactly what Dönitz had warned about. While Germany struggled to replace lost U-boats and train new crews, Allied industrial production accelerated to levels that seemed impossible. Before May 1943, the Allies had been building merchant ships faster than U-boats could sink them. After May 1943, the disparity became overwhelming. American shipyards alone were launching more than 140 Liberty ships per month by mid-1943. British and Canadian yards were producing additional vessels. The combined Allied merchant fleet was growing by millions of tons annually. Each Liberty ship carried 10,000 tons of cargo. Each tanker carried fuel for operations across Europe and the Pacific. The supplies flowing across the Atlantic increased month by month. The U-boats attempted to continue the fight with new tactics and technology. Germany developed the Schnorkel, a breathing tube that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged just below the surface. This meant U-boats could recharge batteries without fully surfacing and exposing themselves to radar detection. German designers also developed new submarine types. The Type 81 U-boat was a revolutionary design, streamlined for high underwater speed with massive battery capacity. It could outrun surface escorts while submerged and remain underwater for days. But the Type 21 submarines came too late and in too few numbers. The first operational boat did not sail until April 1945, weeks before Germany's surrender. German shipyards were building them as fast as resources allowed, but Allied bombing disrupted production. The infrastructure Germany needed to mass-produce advanced submarines was being systematically destroyed. Meanwhile, Allied anti-submarine forces were becoming overwhelming in scale. By 1944, the Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy had over 400 destroyers and corvettes dedicated to escort duty. The United States Navy contributed additional escorts and dozens of escort carriers. Aircraft from Britain, Iceland, Canada, and the United States blanketed the Atlantic with patrol coverage. There was no longer an air gap, no safe waters for U-boats. Submarines that ventured into the Atlantic faced constant attack. They were hunted by aircraft equipped with radar, sonobuoys, and acoustic homing torpedoes. They were hunted by surface groups that could track them for days. And they were dying at rates that made continuing the campaign an act of futility and suicide. From June 1943 to the end of the war, German U-boats sank approximately 850 Allied merchant ships. It sounds significant until you compare it to Allied production. During the same period, Allied shipyards built over 5,000 merchant vessels. For every ship the U-boats sank, the Allies built 6 replacements. The tonnage balance was even more lopsided. Allied construction vastly exceeded losses. The merchant fleet that was supposed to be strangled was growing larger every month. German submariners who survived the war described their despair as they realized what they were facing. They sailed into the Atlantic knowing the odds of survival were diminishing with every patrol. They attacked convoys and watched escorts respond with frightening efficiency. They dove deep to escape depth charge attacks and heard the explosions getting closer as enemy sonar tracked them through the depths. One U-boat commander who survived multiple patrols said the hardest part was not the fear of death. It was the knowledge that their deaths would accomplish nothing. They were fighting a battle that was already lost. Emperor Hirohito himself began to notice the disparity. In late 1943, as reports arrived of mounting U-boat losses, Hitler questioned Dönitz about why the submarine campaign was no longer effective. Dönitz explained the technological challenges, the Allied radar and sonar superiority, the overwhelming number of escorts and patrol aircraft. But Hitler demanded continued attacks. He ordered Dönitz to maintain pressure on Allied shipping regardless of losses. It was a death sentence for thousands of young German sailors. Dönitz obeyed his orders. U-boats continued to sail. Crews boarded their submarines knowing the odds of returning were slim. They sailed anyway, out of duty, out of loyalty, out of hope that they might still make a difference. Most never came back. The final statistics told a story of complete defeat. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in the German U-boat force during World War II, over 30,000 died. The casualty rate exceeded 75%. It was the highest loss rate of any military service in any nation during the war. For comparison, the overall German military suffered approximately 25% casualties. The U-boat force suffered 3 times that rate. They died when depth charges crushed their submarines' hulls in the deep water. They died when patrol aircraft caught them on the surface and bombed them before they could dive. They died slowly, trapped in damaged submarines that could not surface, breathing their last air in the darkness. They died when torpedoes from Allied submarines struck them, or when Allied warships caught them in surface battles and pounded them to pieces with naval gunfire. The British losses were significant but sustainable. The Royal Navy lost over 50,000 sailors during the war, many to U-boat attacks. The Allied merchant navies lost approximately 30,000 men on ships sunk by submarines. These were terrible casualties. Each death was a tragedy, but the British replaced their losses and continued to fight. The convoys kept sailing. The supplies kept flowing. Britain did not starve. British industry did not halt. The sea lanes remained open. After the war, Dönitz was captured and tried at Nuremberg for war crimes. His defense was based on the argument that submarine warfare against merchant shipping was a standard practice used by all sides. The United States had conducted unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan in the Pacific. The British had blockaded Germany. Dönitz was convicted, but not primarily for the U-boat campaign. His sentence was based on other charges. During his imprisonment, he wrote his memoirs and was interrogated extensively by Allied intelligence officers. These post-war interviews revealed that Dönitz had understood Germany's limitations. He had known from the beginning that without overwhelming submarine numbers, the campaign would fail. He had warned his superiors repeatedly. He had been ignored. In his memoirs, Dönitz wrote that the Battle of the Atlantic was lost because Germany could not build submarines faster than the Allies could develop countermeasures and produce escorts. He admitted that British scientific coordination outpaced German innovation. He acknowledged that Allied shipbuilding had replaced losses faster than U-boats could sink them. He stated explicitly that by May 1943, the campaign had become mathematically hopeless. But he also wrote that he had continued because orders demanded it. He had sent men to their deaths knowing the battle was lost because the alternative was to admit defeat. Other German naval officers who survived the war were interviewed about their experiences and assessments. These interrogations, conducted by British and American intelligence services, revealed a pattern of realization. German submariners had gradually come to understand that they were fighting an enemy with superior technology and unlimited resources. Captain Adalbert Schnee, one of Germany's most successful U-boat commanders, told his interrogators that German submariners knew by 1944 that each patrol might be their last. The experienced commanders could feel the balance had shifted. Allied escorts responded too quickly to attacks. Allied aircraft appeared too frequently. The odds of successfully attacking a convoy and escaping had dropped to levels that made the mission nearly suicidal. Another commander spoke of his shock at encountering Allied hunter-killer groups. Before 1943, submarines hunted merchant ships while avoiding escorts. After 1943, Allied escort carriers dispatched dedicated hunter-killer groups that actively searched for submarines. These groups included destroyers equipped with the most advanced sonar and depth charges, supported by aircraft that could track submerged U-boats using sonobuoys. A submarine that was detected by one of these groups faced coordinated attacks from multiple directions. There was no evasion, no escape. The hunter-killer groups pursued submarines for hours, sometimes days, until the U-boat was destroyed or forced to surface and surrender. The fundamental truth that emerged from these interrogations was simple and stark. Germany had attacked a maritime nation with superior naval technology, larger shipbuilding capacity, and vastly greater scientific resources. German planners had hoped that U-boats could starve Britain before American industry mobilized. They assumed that British anti-submarine warfare would remain primitive. They believed that German crews and tactics would overcome technological disadvantages. They got a prolonged war against an enemy that could afford to lose 10 times as many ships and still prevail. The British and Americans absorbed casualties, learned from losses, developed countermeasures, and built new ships faster than Germany could sink them. And the U-boat force, composed of brave men in technologically inferior vessels, was destroyed. Dönitz never saw the final defeat from the front lines. In the final weeks of the war, after Hitler's suicide, Dönitz was named as his successor. For a brief period, from April 30th to May 23, 1945, Dönitz held the title of Führer. His government controlled nothing. It existed only to negotiate surrender terms. On May the 7th, Dönitz authorized General Jodl to sign Germany's unconditional surrender at Allied headquarters in Reims, France. On May 8th, the surrender took effect. On May 23rd, Allied forces arrested Dönitz and his government, ending the Third Reich permanently. He spent 10 years in Spandau prison, convicted at Nuremberg. He was released in 1956 and lived until 1980, long enough to see the Cold War and the nuclear submarines that had made his diesel-electric U-boats obsolete. But nothing in his long life after the war changed the basic truth about the Battle of the Atlantic. He had known from the beginning that Germany lacked the resources to win. He had calculated the numbers and warned his superiors. He had been given insufficient submarines to accomplish his mission. And he had sent thousands of men to die in a campaign that was doomed by mathematics. In his final years, Dönitz refused to apologize for the U-boat campaign. He argued that he had done his duty as a German officer. He maintained that submarine warfare was legitimate. He insisted that Allied tactics were no different from his own. But in private conversations and his writings, a different truth emerged. He acknowledged that the British had outfought Germany at sea. He admitted that Allied technology and production had been overwhelming. He stated that Germany's naval strategy had been hopeless after May 1943. The tragedy of the Battle of the Atlantic was not that Germany underestimated Britain. The tragedy was that Germany's most experienced submarine commander told his government exactly what would happen, and they ordered him to attack anyway. Dönitz warned about British resilience and American production capacity. His colleagues dismissed his concerns as excessive pessimism. Dönitz predicted that without 300 submarines, the campaign would fail. His colleagues assumed that 60 or 100 would suffice. Dönitz calculated that Allied shipbuilding would exceed German sinking capacity. His colleagues believed that British morale would break first. They were wrong about everything, and tens of thousands of people, German submariners, British sailors, Allied merchant seamen, and others across the Atlantic paid the price for their willful blindness. The lesson of the Battle of the Atlantic extends beyond World War II. Dönitz possessed better knowledge of maritime warfare than almost any officer in the German Navy. He provided precise, accurate warnings about what would happen if Germany attacked without adequate resources. And his warnings were ignored because they were politically inconvenient. The Nazi leadership wanted to believe that Britain could be defeated by submarine warfare. They convinced themselves that British society was soft and would collapse under pressure. They assured themselves that Germany's warrior spirit and tactical superiority would overcome material disadvantages. They trusted in propaganda and dismissed material factors as secondary. The wreckage of their empire spread across the Atlantic floor from the American coast to Britain proved them wrong. As those German officers stood in Rheims that May morning, they could see the truth in the statistics. Over 700 U-boats destroyed. Over 30,000 submariners dead. The Allied merchant fleet, larger than ever. Britain unconquered. Grand Admiral Dönitz had given them the answer years before anyone asked the question. He had calculated the mathematics and seen the future. He had warned his nation and been given insufficient resources. And in the end, his prediction proved perfect. Germany had fought bravely but hopelessly, and the British sea power, supported by American production and Allied technology, had responded with force beyond anything the German Navy could overcome. If you found this account of German perspectives on British sea power valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel. We are dedicated to bringing you accurate historical content based on verified sources and documented testimony. Share this video with others who appreciate understanding history from multiple perspectives, and leave a comment telling us which aspect of the Battle of the Atlantic you would like us to explore next. Your support allows us to continue producing educational content that brings important historical lessons to new audiences.